Two meetings with President Biden over the last 2 days, but none as yet, and none planned with Donald Trump. Is there friction there, and is there a sense that this could be a very different treatment of Ukraine if Donald Trump gets back into the White House? We're lucky enough to have Alexander Stubb with us right now. He is the president of Finland. Mr. President, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you a little bit about, I know you have, as I said, that you're going to continue providing aid for Ukraine. You've met with President Zelensky. Some of your counterparts in and around NATO aren't quite so eager to do that now, and now hints from Donald Trump that neither is he. Does that worry you?
Well, I think it's very important for all of us in the alliance to give steadfast support to Ukraine. I think it's in our national interest. It's in the interest of the United States as well. Essentially for a country like Finland, which has 1,340 kilometers of border and one of the largest militaries of Europe, we have the capacity to continue to help Ukraine. We've done so through 24, now 25 packages. I think it's very important that Zelensky wins this war.
You know, you stood out because you wanted to go ahead and lift a lot of these restrictions on Ukraine's long-range, strikes on Russia and the countries that provide the armaments for them to do so, including our own here in the United States. Vladimir Putin has responded that that's the kind of stuff that will threaten a nuclear war. And he's mentioned that, as you know, Mr. President, that is Vladimir Putin and the nuclear weapon thing several times in just the last several weeks. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, two responses to that. First, I think it's very important that Ukraine does not have to fight this war with one hand tied behind its back. I mean, I put myself in the situation, what if we were provided weapons in a war situation and we would not be allowed to use them for defense purposes within the framework of international law, which of course Putin and Russia is breaking every day. I think the other general approach that we have to keep in mind in here is that the rhetoric and the propaganda from Russia and from Putin is always very strong. And to be honest, the more you threaten with nuclear weapons, the less you use them. And here we should actually be thankful to the global South and to a certain extent China, who has usually intervened in this and said, please stop talking about nuclear annihilation. That is very serious.
Are you worried then if Donald Trump comes in? He's been a critic of how long this war has been going on, as you know, sir, and he has argued that he could wrap it up the first day in office. He has since said very, very quickly, we don't know how he would do that. But how do you feel about that?
Well, I think the war can end if four conditions are provided. Number one is territory. And that is, of course, for Ukraine and Zelensky to decide. Number two is security guarantees. So we need to make sure that Russia will never do this again to Ukraine or anyone else. Number three is justice. In other words, we need war criminals in international courts from the Russian side. And then number four is reconstruction. It is an extremely complex package, but I think it's important to talk about two things simultaneously. One is the peace formula, which has 10 points, and Zelensky has outlined. And the second one is, of course, the victory formula. I know that Donald Trump is a transactionalist. He thinks about the interest of the United States, and it is in the interest of the United States that Ukraine wins this war, because otherwise it's basically a victory for Russia and partially also to China.
I don't know if he sees it quite that way, though, with all due respect, Mr. President. He wants this wrapped up, and he is, of course, has very good relations with Vladimir Putin. He is also, when you talk about something transactional, to your point, some have argued, I don't know whether it's Donald Trump himself, that part of a ceasing of hostilities would be to give Vladimir Putin something, that some of the land that he occupies right now would be his to keep, so to speak. In other words, that there would have to be concessions, and you're right to point out that that would be up to the Ukrainian president, but that's really the only realistic way to end this, and that means this is not going to happen very soon.
Well, I respectfully disagree in the sense that at the end of the day, it's all about international law, territorial integrity and sovereignty. It is not right that a country with imperialist tendencies like Russia uses the power and might to acquire territory from another state. If it happens in Ukraine, it'll start happening all over the world, and that's why we need strong American leadership. A final point on that, I believe that the United States wants to remain and stay as a superpower in this world. In order for it to do that, it needs alliances and allies, and the strongest allies, of course, come from Europe, and that's why American engagement in this particular war right now is so important.
All right, the fact that we're not hearing that out of Donald Trump or his running mate, J.D. Vance, in fact, J.D. Vance, much more critical, says it's not worth the trouble to stay in Ukraine. You think that's dangerous talk?
Well, you know, I don't want to take issue with American domestic politics. All I can say is that as President of Finland, I will work very closely with whoever is chosen as President of the United States, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. The United States is an extremely important ally for all of us in Europe. You are in many ways the protector of the free world, and those are the types of values that we need to see the American president driving. And I believe that whoever is chosen, that will happen. We have seen what American disengagement from the world means. We saw that before World War I, we saw that before World War II, and I think it's very important that the United States stays engaged and protects, defends, and drives the values that it stands for, including democracy.
Mr. President, an honor having you, and thanks for stopping by. Get home safely. Very good having you.
Thank you very much.